Hello, it's time to resurrect this channel. In the past couple of videos, I spoke about the strengths of traditional animation, things that it can do that other mediums really can't. Here's another film that suits its medium really well, both thematically in terms of dead puppets coming to life, and also just visually in terms of the relationship between design and technique. So, when it comes to stylized rendering, what can you do with a medium that is inherently photorealistic? You know, because it's literally a sequence of photographs. Well, you couldn't remove the texture if you wanted to, but you can stylize and exaggerate the textures. You can bring in stylized lighting and color palettes, and you can design the characters and environments in such a way as to make it clear you're not trying to emulate the real thing. Because you're working with miniature models in stop motion, the texture of the materials is heightened anyway. You might not explicitly note it, but you know you're looking at a miniature which doesn't walk around in real life. With fantasy stories, I think it's important to establish that relationship with the audience. With a super realistic image, it's almost as if you're trying to con the audience into thinking they're seeing something real. Whereas an image that's openly fabric invites the audience into the fiction. Aardman co-founder Pete Lord expressed a similar thought while he was talking about the wrong trousers at Annecy last year.
I love the fact that the audience can see what it is, that they can see it's clay, and with the small props, like even a small detail like that box that said spare track. If you look at it close up, it's very obviously a small handmade box. You know you're looking at small things and you believe they're alive at the same time. And I think somewhere in there is the magic of stop motion animation, which is why, although we make films many other ways, we make lots of CG films and fundamentally care about the story most of all. But having said that, having said story, I love very much the handmadeness of what we do, and I think it's the joy of what we do.
Basically, the design of the environments is split into two. The land of the living is made to look as dreary as possible, with muted colours, little decoration, and empty spaces. While the land of the dead is colourful and decorative, with much more varied shapes and often more extreme compositions. I noticed that the character designs have a pretty interesting range. The main three characters are the only ones that you really empathise with, and the only ones who have complex thoughts and attitudes. So they're relatively normal looking, because we need to relate to them. The secondary and background characters, though, tend to have the same attitude throughout the film, so the shapes of their designs are based on poses that epitomise their attitude. For example, Victoria's father is a small man trying to raise his social status, so he's half the size of the other characters, and his whole shape is trying to push itself upwards. Barkis has a similar idea, with his features all packed into the top half of his head and tilted back, so that he's always looking down his nose. Victoria's mother and the pastor both put themselves in artificial positions of authority, so they have these huge towers on their heads, and they both have these massive noses and chins, which I'm not sure about, but they do make it more intimidating that when they look at you, their entire face also points right at you. The more humble characters tend to have smaller chins, and features more towards the front of their faces, which makes them look more open to others.
Every character has his own personality, and personality dictates shape, balance, and rhythm. So every character has his own silhouette. So what is important is that we can recognize every single character when we see it on the screen. And they are puppets, so they have to be really graphic and really stylized. So we had to create many shapes.
Tim Burton said this about Carlos Grangel's character designs for the film. The great thing I think Carlos brought to a lot of the characters, the background characters, because there's a lot of them that didn't have a lot of screen time, was that you can look at them and you see their character. You see some of the relatives who've come in for the wedding, and you just get it right away. The actual puppets themselves are built with a variety of techniques, but Victor, Victoria and Emily's puppets use this pretty outstanding technique for the facial animation, which I don't think I've ever seen anywhere else. The insides of their heads contained tiny little clockwork mechanisms that controlled the facial features, which were adjusted by the animators with little keys. The systems of gears gave the animators extremely fine control and allowed for some subtle performances that really hadn't been attempted in stop motion prior to this film. I asked Anthony Scott, the animation supervisor, how well stop motion fits these kinds of performances. He said, "I think it depends what you're trying to do. What's the style of animation that's required? Realistic, cartoony, or something in between?" Corpse Bride tended towards realistic on purpose. I think the realistic style can be a good fit, while it is certainly more challenging to animate. It's generally easier on the eyes when watching on the big screen. Laika's films specialise in a realistic style of animation. One particular sequence that I think really shows off what these animators were able to pull off is the piano duet. The earlier sequence with Victor and Victoria by a piano, animated by Phil Dale, is also an incredible piece of work, and both sequences are super expressive without being wild. The duet scene was animated by Mark Waring, with Anthony doing the close-ups of the hands. It's a really brilliant feat in terms of animating the characters' thoughts in relation to each other. If you haven't seen the movie in a while, the context of the scene is that Victor is coming over to reason with Emily after she found out about his engagement to Victoria. This shot where Victor starts to approach her is really effective at showing the relationship between the two characters. If you hadn't seen the film before, you'd get the gist pretty quickly. A huge visual clue is that the characters are separated by colour. Victor's half of the screen is warm, and Emily's is pretty cold. By the end of the sequence, the colours in the background are a bit more blended. Let's watch Emily's expression on its own. When she notices he's behind her, she decides to ignore him, and the way the animator shows that she's deliberately ignoring him is by having her adopt the aloof expression after she hears his footsteps, and only opening her eyes when her head is turned away from him enough that he wouldn't see. She stays that way through the first minute or so of the sequence, and only glances at him once he starts playing. When Victor first opens his mouth to say "I," there's a pause and you still hear the piano. He sees that she's ignoring him and drops his eye contact. It's a cue from the voice actor that the animator has picked up on and interpreted in his animation.
I think you dropped this.
As the two begin to connect through the piano playing, there are moments of eye contact, and the poses become less despondent, basically straightening their backs and raising their heads. Victor notices the connection and leans towards Emily as he hits his chords. What keeps the piano strokes looking gentle and graceful is that the forearm is always moving, anticipating the next chord. So, on a sustained chord after the initial hit, only the fingers are pressing the keys without much weight. Earlier in the sequence, when Emily was playing on her own, her forearm stayed down longer with each hit because she was low in spirits. Once they start playing together, Emily starts enjoying herself and their head movements match the music. The peak of her head's movement arc hits this chord on the way up and this one on the way down. During the close-ups in this scene, you can really see the fine facial animation. For this kind of animation, the spacing is really crucial because if, for example, a head turns a little more aggressively, it might have completely different implications about the character's intent. There are two main ways that stop-motion animators keep track of their animation, with onion skinning software and with these little mechanical things called surface gauges. To give you an idea of the technology at the time, Corpse Bride and the Wallace and Gromit movie were both being made around the same time. They were still using 35mm cameras to film Wallace and Gromit. Meanwhile, Corpse Bride was an early adopter of using DSLR cameras to shoot stop motion. They'd attach a little webcam to the viewfinder of the camera, which gave them a live feed of the camera's view. Using a frame grabber software, they can see the animation that they've already filmed and overlay the previously shot frame with the live feed to compare the spacing between the two frames. Some animators draw their arcs on the monitor with a dry erase marker to plan the movement. Surface gauges are used to track movement in the real space. So, say you've shot one frame. Before you move anything again, you go in and you point the surface gauge at the thing you're about to move. If it's an arm, you'd maybe point it at the tip of the finger. Then, when you do move it, you can see where it was and judge how far apart to make the current frame. As an equivalent to key animation in CG or 2D animation, the animators actually rehearse scenes. Anthony told me about it. He said, typically the animator would shoot 2 tests and then the final shot. The first test, called a pop through or a block, was a simple test showing key poses and rough timing. Basically, popping from one extreme pose to another. I try to shoot this test quickly on and get it to the director as soon as possible, so that it can be reviewed, have changes made to the acting, the camera, lighting, or the set. The next test, called a run through or just a rehearsal, is more refined. Animation is on 4s generally, and this is the final test before the shot is launched.
Yet I feel my heart is aching, though it doesn't beat, it's breaking. And the pain here that I feel, try and tell me it's not real. I know that I am dead, yet it seems that I still have some tears to shed.
To be honest, it's still kind of over my head the way these animators are able to create such controlled performances with completely straight ahead animation. But if you want to see more of Anthony's work, you can check out The Little Prince on Netflix, and if you want to learn more about stop motion animation, the model making, where to get the materials, that sort of thing, check out stopmotionanimation.com. It's got loads of tutorials and it's got a message board where you can get advice from experienced people.